Some secrets do not sleep in tombs, but breathe in the hearts of living men. Tonight's tale begins with a midnight visitor to Baker Street, his coat heavy with fear, and a story of 12 men who once unearthed more than the desert was willing to surrender. Where are you tuning in from? And what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us walk beside Holmes and Watson into the fog, where superstition and reason will soon collide. It was on a bitterly cold London evening, when the fog pressed thick against our windows and the fire burned low in the grate, that I found myself once more in the company of Sherlock Holmes. He had been peculiarly restless that week, prowling about the sitting room like some lean and watchful hound deprived of the scent. My medical practice was quiet at the time, and I confess I was not displeased to spend the evening in his society. He sat, long limbs sprawled, in his accustomed chair, the thin blue spiral of his pipe rising toward the ceiling. From time to time he tapped the armrest impatiently, as though the very silence of the city were an affront. When no case occupied him, Holmes was a man in torment, and I braced myself for one of his abrupt sallies into deduction to relieve the tedium. I had attempted, somewhat furtively, to conceal a recently published medical article of mine beneath a pile of newspapers. Holmes's quick eye, however, missed nothing. "You have been labouring in vain, Watson," he remarked, with the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. "A man who writes an essay only to blush at its sight is surely guilty of either overconfidence or overconcision. Judging from your expression, I should wager the latter." I laughed, though not without embarrassment, for his arrow had struck true. His amusement was brief, however, for even in humour, Holmes displayed a restless impatience. The clock upon our mantel had scarcely struck 12 when a sudden and emphatic knock resounded through the quiet of Baker Street. Holmes sprang from his chair with the alacrity of a man reprieved from monotony. Mrs. Hudson, roused from her slumber, ushered in a tall figure wrapped in a heavy travelling cloak, the folds of which dripped with the damp of the night. His movements betrayed both urgency and hesitation, as though every step forward was taken against his will. Holmes's eyes lit with interest, and he motioned the man to enter without so much as a word. I, for my part, felt the old thrill that presaged the beginning of one of our singular adventures. Our visitor lowered his hood, revealing features pale with strain and eyes that darted about the room as though fearful of some unseen pursuer. His hand trembled slightly as he laid aside his cloak, and I could not but remark the fine quality of his attire, the cut and cloth of which bespoke considerable wealth. Holmes, however, seemed less occupied with the man's face than with the trifles he carried upon him. "You perceive, Watson," he murmured, "the fragrance of Egyptian tobacco, unmistakable, and the scarab pin upon his lapel. Both suggest long familiarity with Cairo." The gentleman started at this observation, his lips parting as if to speak, then closing again in silence. There was, in his every motion, the air of a man pursued by phantoms of memory. As I observed him, I could not escape the impression that our visitor bore more than the mere weight of fear upon his shoulders. It was as though some relic of a darker age clung to him, invisible yet palpable, casting a shadow that reached even into our well-lit rooms. The scarab upon his breast gleamed dully in the firelight, and I found myself recalling the grim legends of Eastern tombs and forgotten kings. Whatever business had brought him to Holmes, I knew instinctively it would prove no common affair. In that moment, he seemed the very embodiment of an ancient curse upon modern man. The stranger stood before our fire with a heaviness that seemed to burden his very frame. At last, mustering what dignity remained, he inclined his head and gave his name. "I am Sir Reginald Phelps," said he, his voice marked by the tremor of one long unused to asking favours. The title was not unfamiliar to me, for his diplomatic service had been whispered in connection with several delicate affairs of the crown, yet the man before us was far removed from the confident envoy of old. His features were drawn, his eyes shadowed by nights without repose. Holmes regarded him steadily, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Your years in Cairo have left more than the sands of memory clinging to you, Sir Reginald," he observed. A flicker of surprise crossed our visitor's face, but he made no reply, content to lower himself wearily into the chair Holmes indicated. I could see that he was a man who had borne grave matters alone and was now at the end of his resources. When his composure had returned somewhat, Sir Reginald began his tale in measured tones, as though each word carried the weight of an oath. Years earlier, he explained, he had served in Cairo during a time when British influence extended deep into the Nile Valley. There, by fortune or folly, he had become entangled in a private expedition led by 12 men of various callings, soldiers, scholars, and fortune-seekers alike. Together, they had ventured into the desert, following the whispered directions of a local guide to a tomb long lost beneath shifting sands. What they found there, Sir Reginald would not disclose in full, but it was clear that something of unusual value had been unearthed. To the outside world they reported little, concealing their discovery with a pact sealed among themselves. "The 12 of us swore secrecy," said he, his gaze fixed on the floor. "But secrecy is a fragile bond, Dr. Watson. It frays with age, and it withers when men grow fearful." Holmes's eyes glimmered with curiosity. "You speak of a pact," he said, "and pacts, like curses, rarely survive the men who make them." Sir Reginald shifted uneasily. "I had hoped you would not use that word, Mr. Holmes, for it is precisely a curse that now dogs us." Sir Reginald leaned forward, lowering his voice as if the very walls might overhear. One by one, he recited the names of his former companions, now silent in their graves. Each death, he insisted, had come not through chance, but in a fashion peculiar enough to arouse grave suspicion. One had been found lifeless in his study, the door locked from within, a mark upon his chest shaped like an eye. Another had drowned in the Thames, though he had never in life so much as set foot upon a boat. A third had perished abroad, struck down in a manner too sudden to be natural. "What unites these ends, Sir Reginald," Holmes interjected, "is not their variety, but their deliberate impression of inevitability. That is the true artifice." The man shuddered. "5 have fallen already. Of the 12, 7 remain, if I may count myself among them for much longer." His hand clutched the armrest tightly, the knuckles whitening with dread. "It is as though the sands of Egypt have stretched their shadow across England, taking us one by one." I confess that even my own flesh prickled at the thought, though Holmes merely inclined his head, as though confirming a hypothesis. Holmes rose, paced once across the hearthrug, and then stood suddenly before Sir Reginald, his keen grey eyes fixed upon him. "You have not slept soundly in weeks," he said with brisk certainty. "Your shoes betray the scuff of repeated pacing. The pallor of your skin and the heaviness beneath your eyes speak of insomnia. Moreover, the bulge in your cloak pocket is too angular for a purse and too heavy for a mere notebook. A revolver, then, a constant companion of the anxious." Sir Reginald started visibly, his lips forming a protest that quickly died upon them. "And lastly," Holmes continued, "your hand strays to your breast as though to guard against more than a beating heart. Letters, I think. Letters whose words disturb you greatly. Anonymous, I should suppose, for otherwise they would already be in the hands of the authorities." The diplomat's expression betrayed astonishment and reluctant admiration. "You are correct, Mr. Holmes. Each point you have uttered is the truth. It seems I cannot keep my secrets even when I do not speak them aloud." Pressed by Holmes's unrelenting gaze, Sir Reginald at last produced a bundle of envelopes, worn at the edges from repeated handling. He laid them upon the table with a sigh. Holmes drew one forth delicately and studied its contents. The script was harsh and angular, and the words themselves couched in the language of menace. "You who profaned the tomb," one read, "shall not escape the hand of vengeance. The eye watches, and its stroke shall find you. Another carried the drawing of an eye crudely sketched, beneath which a date was inscribed. On each occasion, Sir Reginald explained, the appointed date had preceded the death of one of his companions. Holmes tapped the letter lightly against his palm. The theatricality is unmistakable. A mind skilled in fear-mongering, but also systematic in execution. He cast the paper aside. I could not help but shiver. Surely, Holmes, there is a diabolical hand behind this. There is indeed a hand, Watson, he replied, but hardly diabolical, merely human, and therein lies both its danger and its limitation. Sir Reginald, however, looked far from reassured. His face was that of a man staring into the abyss. At length, Sir Reginald's composure broke, and he spoke with sudden fervour. You must understand, gentlemen, that I am not a man easily cowed. I have faced assassins in foreign courts and intrigues that would chill the bravest spirit. Yet never have I felt the creeping dread that now besets me. Each time the clock strikes, I wonder if it tolls for me. Holmes regarded him with that peculiar mixture of sympathy and detachment that so often marked his manner. You fear, Sir Reginald, that you are marked as the next in this grim sequence. The diplomat nodded gravely. Yes, 5 gone, and 7 remain. The stroke of fate will not pause for long. I am convinced it will fall upon me next, unless you can unravel this sinister business. That is why I come to you, Mr. Holmes, not merely for counsel, but for protection. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Holmes's eyes glimmered with the satisfaction of a challenge worthy of his powers. My dear Sir Reginald, he said at last, you could not have chosen better. For if a curse is but a veil for crime, then it is a veil I shall rend apart. Early the next morning, Holmes set before us the names of those 12 men who had once stood together in the Egyptian sands. He had procured the list through channels known only to himself, and I confess that the precision of his knowledge never ceased to astonish me. Together we pored over the names, each bearing the weight of a history now darkened by fear. Observe, Watson, said he, pointing with his long forefinger. 5 of these names bear a grim mark beside them. 5 gone, 7 remaining. Such a pattern is rarely coincidence. I noted with unease that the dates of death fell in a curious sequence, each within months of the other, as though a hidden hand had struck with calculated intervals. Holmes, however, was less struck by the sequence than by the men themselves. Soldiers, scholars, adventurers, and officials, he murmured. A most varied company, yet bound by a common thread. It is not the desert alone that unites them, but something carried from it. Something strong enough to demand silence and terrible enough to enforce it. His eyes gleamed with that peculiar light I had come to recognize, the certainty that beneath apparent chance lay design. Holmes then set about examining the manner of each man's death, drawing from his inexhaustible collection of clippings, letters, and whispered reports. Note here, Watson, he said, a drowning, though the victim could not swim, a locked room demise with a mark upon the chest, a sudden seizure in a man of otherwise sound constitution. These are not merely deaths, they are performances. I frowned. Performances? Indeed, each death bears a stamp, an intention to inspire dread. Whoever orchestrates this business seeks not only to kill, but to terrify the survivors. The essence of a curse is not the act itself, but the belief it engenders. It struck me then that Holmes regarded superstition not as folly, but as a tool in the arsenal of cunning men. I confess that my heart sank at the thought of intelligent villainy cloaked in the trappings of ancient terror. Our next step took us to the British Museum, where the quiet halls were thick with dust and the scent of parchment. Holmes moved with restless energy among the shelves, pulling forth records until at last he gave a cry of satisfaction. Here, Watson, observe this entry. He laid before me a faded note from years past, penned in a hand half smudged with age. It spoke of a sarcophagus, briefly catalogued and then struck from the register, as though it had never existed. The accompanying memorandum bore the signatures of names familiar from our list of 12. They concealed it, Holmes declared, his eyes alight. The discovery was never made public. Whatever lies within that sarcophagus is the nucleus of this affair. I glanced around the vast hall, shivering despite the warmth. And men have died to keep it hidden, or to keep it claimed, Holmes replied. His tone was sharp, his face inscrutable. The tombs of kings have long arms, Watson, but it is human ambition that guides them. Holmes's inquiries soon led us to one of the surviving members of the fateful 12, a certain Major Blackwell, whose address was obtained with some difficulty. We found him in a small lodging house off Gloucester Road, where he received us with all the nervousness of a man who glances twice at every shadow. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes darting to the window as though he expected the very air to carry menace. At length, with trembling hands, he unlocked a small casket and withdrew an object wrapped in cloth. When the covering fell away, it revealed a lump of wax impressed with a strange emblem, an eye, rendered in bold strokes, with a line descending beneath it. "The Eye of Horus," Blackwell whispered. We each received one, as a token of our oath. At first, it was a mere memento, but lately it has returned to me in letters and marks left upon my door. Holmes examined the seal closely, holding it to the light with keen interest. "A symbol of vigilance," said he, "but also of control. Whoever employs it now seeks to remind you that the pact is not forgotten." The Major shuddered visibly. "Then I am already marked." Later, as we retraced the particulars of the deaths, Holmes grew animated, spreading newspaper clippings and coroner's notes upon our table. "Observe these dates, Watson," said he, "and note how the reported times of death vary curiously with the known circumstances of each man's last movements. In 2 cases, the hour declared by witnesses is contradicted by the condition of the body. In another, the telegram announcing the demise was dispatched before the man was last seen alive." I blinked in astonishment. Surely such errors are mere clerical mishaps. Holmes gave a thin smile. Clerical mishaps do not fall consistently in favour of the same unseen hand. These discrepancies are deliberate. The murderer manipulates not only the manner of death, but its chronology, ensuring that confusion reigns among those who might otherwise discern a pattern. The revelation struck me with the chill of recognition. What we had taken as chaos was in fact design. Holmes, with an expression of theatrical relish, next produced a fragment of papyrus that Sir Reginald had passed to him among the letters. Its hieroglyphics seemed crude, the ink faded with age, and to my eye it bore all the hallmarks of a trinket meant to frighten the unlearned. "Now watch closely, Watson," Holmes instructed. He placed the fragment beneath a lens, tilted it toward the lamplight, and traced the marks with his long finger. "You perceive a curse, I perceive a cipher. Each supposed hieroglyph corresponds not to a deity, but to a letter. The message reads, quite plainly, 'You are next,'" I started. "Good heavens! So the papyrus is not a relic at all, but a threat." "Exactly," Holmes said, with a note of satisfaction. "The writer relies upon superstition to obscure his intent. Yet beneath the mask of the ancient, we find only the hand of the modern criminal." Holmes leaned back in his chair, his expression one of grave determination. "Let us then discard, Watson, any notion of supernatural doom. What masquerades as a curse is but the work of a calculating intelligence. It is theatrical, systematic, and above all, purposeful. This is no phantom from the sands of Egypt, but a man who walks among us." I confess a measure of relief, though it was tinged with dread. "And yet, Holmes, does that not render the matter more perilous? For we may guard against phantoms only with prayer, but against men we must pit ourselves directly." "Quite so," Holmes replied, "and therein lies our advantage. A curse defies reason, but a man leaves traces. The mind that arranges such a campaign cannot move without betraying itself in detail. And it is detail, Watson, that never escapes me. His words, delivered with calm assurance, seemed to steady even my own wavering spirit. Still, as the fire crackled in our hearth, I could not shake the thought that the shadow of Egypt had followed us home, embodied in a mind bent on vengeance. For several days, Holmes remained absorbed in his investigations, emerging from his desk only to utter some clipped remark or to pace furiously about the room. At last, one evening, he thrust a bundle of documents toward me with a gleam in his eye. "Watson," said he, "our story grows stranger still. Colonel Harrington, one of the 12, was reported dead 2 years ago in a hunting accident. Yet the details of that death do not withstand scrutiny." I looked at him in astonishment. But surely his body was identified. "Identified by a single companion, and that under conditions ill-suited to certainty," Holmes replied. "The report bears inconsistencies in time, and the supposed remains were interred hastily. More curious still, a man of strikingly similar stature appears under another name in shipping records within weeks of Harrington's alleged demise." The thought chilled me. "You mean to say, Holmes, that Harrington still walks among us?" "Not merely walks, Watson. He directs. A death reported, a name changed, and a shadowy hand now moving behind these so-called curses. It is the neatest form of invisibility, to be dead in the eyes of the world, while living freely to pursue one's ends." His words hung in the air with terrible weight, for the dead had returned not as victim, but as architect. Holmes set before me a series of testimonies gathered through means which, to this day, I cannot fully account for. They came from servants, clerks, and innkeepers, whose paths had briefly crossed with a certain Mr. Harwood, a gentleman of commanding presence and exact military bearing. "Strip away the false whiskers, Watson," Holmes remarked dryly, "and you will find Colonel Harrington beneath. Our friend has taken the stage with commendable artifice." He laid out the evidence with calm precision, the payments traced to an anonymous account, the journeys coinciding with the deaths of the expedition men, the curious presence of this Mr. Harwood in each locale before tragedy struck. "All this," Holmes concluded, "points to one hand moving the pieces. Harrington is alive, and it is he who has spun the web of fear that now entangles Sir Reginald and his fellows." I felt a surge of indignation. But for what purpose? Why torment his old companions? Why stage such elaborate deceptions? Holmes steepled his fingers. "Ah, Watson, therein lies the heart of the matter. Men do not kill without profit, be it of purse, pride, or passion. Our colonel, I suspect, has one motive above all others, and it is buried in the sands of Egypt." Holmes turned to a locked drawer and withdrew a single page, yellowed with age, bearing the notes we had uncovered in the museum. "Here, my dear Watson, lies the colonel. The sarcophagus concealed by the 12 was not empty. Within lay a relic of immense value, an artifact of such rarity that any museum in Europe would pay dearly for it. I studied the faded writing, which spoke of an inlaid mask wrought of gold and lapis, said to be of a forgotten dynasty. The mere description set my imagination aflame. Holmes, however, remained cool. "The mask is not merely treasure. It is leverage. To possess it is to hold power over those who once swore to share it. Harrington, alive and embittered, seeks sole ownership. The deaths, the threats, the curse. These are but steps in a campaign to eliminate rivals and secure the prize unchallenged." The enormity of the scheme struck me forcibly. "Then the murders are not vengeance, but calculation." "Precisely," said Holmes. "A relic worth killing for, and a man ruthless enough to kill. The curse is but the costume, the motive is as old as Cain." His tone was cold, decisive, and it sent a shiver through me. The notion that a man once mourned and buried might now walk among us filled me with instinctive repugnance. "Holmes," I exclaimed, "the thought is monstrous. Harrington was reported dead. his body committed to the earth, his companions satisfied. To imagine him rising from that grave to conduct this reign of terror, surely it is too fanciful. Holmes looked up from his desk with a faint smile. My dear Watson, truth is often fanciful until it is proved. Do you not recall the dog that did not bark, or the serpent concealed in a basket? Our world is full of improbabilities until they stand unmasked as inevitabilities. I pressed the point. But the evidence of death, the burial. A burial without proper scrutiny, Holmes interrupted. A death vouched for by too few. When facts are scarce, belief rushes in to fill the void. Yet belief is not proof. What I offer you is logic, and logic, Watson, rarely misleads me. His tone was calm, almost chiding, and I found myself silenced, though not convinced. Still, I could not shake the feeling that if the dead might live, then no safety remained to mortal men. Holmes proceeded to draw out the manner in which Harrington, shedding his old name, might have lived undetected. Consider, Watson, he began. A man of military carriage and educated speech may be clothed in many guises. A change of whiskers, a shift of accent, the careful adoption of a new circle, and behold, the colonel is reborn as another. He spread before me reports of a certain traveller, a collector of curiosities, whose presence was noted in several towns just prior to the mysterious deaths. The descriptions varied, but all hinted at the same commanding stature, the same restless air of authority. The art of disguise, Holmes said with relish, is not in the mask, but in the manner. Harrington alters his features as a man alters his coat, but his habits betray him. The military precision with which he addresses servants, the rigidity of his step, the commanding eye, all these persist, however hidden beneath false whiskers. I marvelled. You mean that he cannot escape himself? Precisely. Identity, Watson, is a web of details, and no man can sever every thread. In the end, the spider betrays its own design. At length, Holmes turned his attention to the survivors of that fateful band. 6 remain besides Sir Reginald, he said. They gather from time to time, bound not by friendship, but by mutual dread. Their next meeting will prove most instructive. You mean to attend it? I asked in surprise. Indeed, said Holmes, his eyes gleaming. A dinner has been arranged in St. James's, ostensibly to mark the anniversary of their Egyptian enterprise. I believe Harrington will not be far from such an assembly, for it offers him the opportunity to mark his next victim, or to gloat over their terror. I felt a chill. But would he not recognize you at once? Holmes gave a slight shrug. Recognition is a matter of expectation, Watson. They will look for Harrington among the dead, not among the living. As for myself, I shall be but another face in the crowd, and one not easily suspected. Though reassured in part, I could not silence the anxiety that stirred within me. The thought of Holmes venturing into a circle marked by death seemed perilous indeed. Holmes busied himself with preparations that evening, gathering small items into his case with a precision that brooked no interruption. I attempted once or twice to draw from him the details of his scheme, but he deflected my inquiries with that enigmatic half-smile which always irritated and fascinated me in equal measure. My dear Watson, he said at last, you shall know all in good time. For now, it is sufficient that you accompany me, observe closely, and trust that I have not misjudged the game. I could not repress my exasperation. You ask me to stand in darkness while you play with fire. And yet, Holmes replied serenely, you have seldom been singed by trusting me. There was nothing more to be said. He closed his case, struck a match for his pipe, and sat back in his chair, as though every piece upon the chessboard were already arranged to his liking. I watched him in silence, torn between frustration at his secrecy and admiration for his unshakable composure. Holmes's preparations were at last revealed when, on the appointed evening, he appeared before me transformed. With his beard darkened, his hair brushed forward, and a pair of wire spectacles perched upon his nose, he might well have been taken for a professor of Eastern antiquities. His accent, when he addressed me, bore that peculiar rhythm of the Levant, and I marvelled as ever at his ability to clothe himself in another man's skin. Thus disguised, he led me into the private dining room of a club in St. James's, where 6 men already sat gathered round a long table. They rose to greet us, though their expressions betrayed little warmth. Each bore upon his face the mark of strain, as if haunted by ghosts that dined with them. Sir Reginald, pale and drawn, clutched at my hand in silent relief at our arrival. Introductions were made, Holmes passing easily as a foreign scholar of the East, while I assumed the humbler role of his physician companion. The men welcomed us with courtesy, yet every glance exchanged carried suspicion, as though each feared the other might soon vanish from their company. The air was thick with apprehension. Though the fire burned bright and the table was laden with delicacies, unease hung like smoke above the company. Holmes leaned toward me, murmuring in the accent of his assumed character, "Observe, Watson, fear binds them tighter than any oath they once swore." I nodded, unsettled, for it seemed that each man present felt the shadow of death upon him, and none dared confess it aloud. The dinner commenced with a toast to absent friends, though the words rang hollow in that tense chamber. Glasses clinked, but the sound was brittle, like the snapping of thin ice. Conversation moved fitfully, faltering under the weight of unspoken dread. I noticed that each man avoided the eyes of his fellows, preferring instead to study his wine or the flicker of the candles. When speech did arise, it carried with it a guarded quality, as though every phrase were weighed before release. One gentleman, a colonel of engineers, remarked with nervous laughter that they were fortunate to be gathered at all, considering their dwindling number. Another muttered that perhaps fortune had little to do with it. The words fell flat, and silence returned like a shroud. Holmes, adopting the guise of a curious scholar, ventured polite inquiries about their time in Egypt. At once, the company stiffened. Replies came curt, evasive, and tinged with suspicion. It was plain that the mere mention of their expedition carried with it the memory of secrets too dangerous to revive. Leaning close, Holmes whispered so only I could hear, "Note the shifting eyes, the clenched hands. Men under strain, Watson, reveal themselves most in what they do not say." I felt the truth of it keenly, for their silence spoke more loudly than their words. It was at the height of the meal, when the clatter of plates momentarily masked the tension, that the calamity occurred. One of the guests, a scholar of antiquities, lifted his glass, drank deeply, and within moments gave a strangled cry. His face blanched, his body convulsed, and he fell back in his chair, clutching his throat. The company erupted into panic. Chairs scraped, voices shouted, and the cry of "Poison!" rang out above the din. Sir Reginald sprang to his feet, trembling violently, while another guest made for the door, only to be restrained by Holmes's commanding voice. "Gentlemen," he thundered, discarding for a moment the accent of his disguise, "remain seated. There is no danger." The words, spoken with iron authority, stilled them, though terror still flickered in every eye. Holmes rose, his disguise slipping from him like a discarded cloak, and I saw the astonishment on every face as they beheld him in his true form. "This man is not poisoned," Holmes declared, kneeling swiftly beside the fallen figure. "The fit is feigned, or rather induced by harmless means." He produced a small vial from his pocket, holding it aloft. A preparation I administered earlier to reveal the guilty hand when it reached for its prize. The room, moments before in chaos, now held its breath, and in that silence, Holmes's eyes turned not to the convulsing man, but to a quiet figure at the side of the room, a waiter who had watched the proceedings with too much attention. The moment had reached its height, when Holmes, abandoning his assumed character, tore away his false beard and spectacles, rising with such authority that every voice in the room fell silent. His eyes blazed with the thrill of revelation as he spoke. "Gentlemen, you have been deceived, but not poisoned. The collapse you have witnessed is no act of malignancy, but of design, my own design in fact, contrived to flush from concealment the true hand behind your terror." Gasps of astonishment broke from the company, while Sir Reginald half rose, staring at Holmes as though at a phantom. For myself, I confess I had scarcely expected such a bold revelation at so critical a moment. Holmes bent briefly over the convulsing guest, whose spasms already began to subside, and held aloft the small vial I had seen earlier. A harmless draught, calculated to simulate distress, but free of danger. I administered it unknown to the subject, in order to provide the bait required. A true criminal, scenting opportunity, cannot resist betraying himself. His words cut through the panic like a blade. Chairs scraped, men craned forward, and all eyes turned to Holmes, who, with an almost theatrical flourish, straightened to his full height. The curse is a lie, the death's a murder, and the architect of both is not far from this room. It was then that Holmes's gaze, sharp as a hawk's, fell upon a figure who until that moment had passed unnoticed. A waiter stood by the wall, tray in hand, his face composed, yet his eyes betrayed too close an attention to every word that fell from Holmes's lips. "Step forward, sir," Holmes commanded. "The company has been incomplete without you." The man hesitated, his knuckles whitening upon the tray. Then, with a sudden movement, he cast it aside, sending glasses shattering across the floor. His hand flew to his face, and in the confusion of broken glass and startled cries, the false whiskers slipped away. A murmur, half horror and half recognition, swept the room. "Colonel Harrington!" cried Sir Reginald, his voice breaking. The figure straightened, and for the first time in years, the man believed to be long dead stood revealed. His features were leaner, his eyes harder, but the military carriage was unmistakable. "You are clever, Mr. Holmes," he said coldly, "but cleverness will not bind me." Holmes's reply was ice. "Your cleverness, Colonel, lay in dying at the proper moment. Yet even death cannot conceal the mark of a soldier. You have killed 5 of your comrades, and would have killed more, but your game is ended." For an instant, Harrington's gaze swept the room, measuring his foes. Then, with a sudden burst of violence, he struck aside the nearest chair and dashed for the door. Holmes, already anticipating the move, signalled sharply to me. "After him, Watson!" he cried, and the chase began. Out into the night Harrington fled, his figure swallowed almost at once by the thick London fog that hung heavy over St. James's. Holmes darted after him with astonishing speed, and I followed close upon his heels, my heart pounding with the excitement of the chase. Shouts rang out as 2 constables, alerted by the commotion, joined our pursuit. The fog lay in ghostly banks, obscuring the gas lamps and muffling every sound save the echo of boots striking cobblestones. More than once I thought we had lost him, but Holmes, guided by some instinct all his own, pressed on unerringly. "There!" he cried, pointing to a shadow flitting down a side street. The figure turned, sharply, disappearing into the maze of alleys that threaded toward the river. Harrington ran with desperate strength, but the pursuit behind him gathered force. I confess that more than once I stumbled, blinded by the fog, yet Holmes never faltered. His silhouette loomed before me, a dark shape pursuing another through the shifting vapours. At last, the sound of water reached my ears, and I realised that the chase was driving us inexorably toward the docks. At the river's edge, we came upon him. Harrington had gained the wharf and was hastily dragging a heavy chest toward a waiting skiff moored at the water's side. The lantern light gleamed upon the metal fittings, and I guessed at once that it contained the relic for which so many lives had been spent. "Stand where you are, Colonel," Holmes called, his voice ringing out across the timbers. Harrington turned, pistol flashing in his hand. A shot rang out, splintering the wood near Holmes, but before he could fire again the constables closed in. I too rushed forward, and together we grappled with the desperate man. The struggle was fierce. Harrington fought with the fury of one who battles not merely for freedom but for obsession itself. At length he was borne down, the pistol torn from his grasp, and his wrist secured in iron. He lay panting upon the planks, glaring up at Holmes with undiminished malice. "You think you have won," he spat, "but the mask is mine, the mask is Egypt's, and it will outlast you all." Holmes regarded him coldly. "Relics may endure, Colonel, but men who kill for them do not." With that, Harrington was hauled to his feet, and the shadow of his reign ended upon the riverbank. The tumult of the night, with its pursuit through fog-bound streets and grim struggle at the docks, seemed but a fevered dream, once we found ourselves once more within the calm embrace of our Baker Street chambers. The familiar crackle of the fire, the well-worn armchairs, and the steady tick of the mantel clock stood in marked contrast to the chaos we had so recently endured. Holmes, divested of his disguise and once more the master of his own hearth, reclined with a long sigh of satisfaction, his fingertips pressed together in that attitude so familiar to me. I confess that my own body still bore the tremors of exertion, and I was glad to collapse opposite him, though my mind yet wrestled with unanswered questions. "Well, Holmes," I said, "we have captured the villain and secured the relic, but the manner of it all remains to me a labyrinth. You promised an explanation, and I shall hold you to your word." A faint smile crossed his lips, and his eyes gleamed in the firelight. "My dear Watson, explanations are the final course in the feast of reason. Let us then begin." Holmes leaned forward, his voice low and measured, each word falling with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The Egyptian curse, which so alarmed Sir Reginald and his companions, was never more than the invention of Harrington. A man presumed dead possesses the greatest freedom, Watson, for he moves unseen, unchallenged, and above suspicion. Harrington exploited this liberty to weave the terror of a phantom hand striking from beyond the grave. I recalled the convulsions at the dinner table, the wax seals, the whispered dread among the men, and shuddered. But surely, Holmes, no sane man could believe such a thing. Superstition, my good fellow, is the oldest cloak of villainy. Men of science though they fancied themselves, those 12 were bound by deeds too dark to withstand the scrutiny of daylight. A curse offered them both an explanation and an absolution. Harrington knew their fears, for he shared their secrets, and thus played upon them as a musician upon his instrument. Holmes rose, pacing the hearthrug. He killed 5 in succession, each death lending weight to the illusion of supernatural justice. And because men prefer to fear the unseen rather than confront the visible, they accepted the fiction with scarcely a protest. Sir Reginald's terror was not of a curse, but of his own guilty conscience, sharpened by Harrington's design. Holmes resumed his seat, a faint look of disdain upon his face. Thus, Watson, the curse was laid bare, not a visitation from ancient tombs, but the stratagem of a man who understood fear more deeply than truth. Holmes next drew from the table a small packet of wax impressions, taken from the seals shown to us earlier. He spread them before me with the air of a lecturer displaying specimens to his students. You see here the emblem of the Eye of Horus stamped upon each. To Sir Reginald and his companions, these were tokens of dread. In truth, they were but the marks of their own making. During their expedition in Cairo, the 12 men formed a secret compact. They had concealed the discovery of a sarcophagus, and to bind themselves to silence, they fashioned a brotherhood after the manner of a lodge, with these seals as its badge. I examined them more closely. Then these were not the instruments of some occult society, but the handiwork of guilty men to secure one another's silence. Precisely, Watson. Yet symbols once created acquire a life of their own. What was first a pledge of complicity became, in the hands of Harrington, a weapon of fear. He sent them forth as warnings, investing them with the authority of a doom the men themselves had imagined. Holmes paused to relight his pipe, and the thin wreaths of smoke curled upward, like the ghost of the false curse itself. Thus the Eye of Horus served not to ward off profane intruders, but to remind each man of the secret that chained him. Harrington turned their own emblem against them, until they trembled at the sight of what they had once devised in drunken camaraderie beneath the desert stars. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that peculiar fire that always kindled when he reached the heart of his exposition. "You will recall, Watson, that I remarked upon the curious order of the deaths. At first glance, they seemed haphazard, but on closer scrutiny, they followed with remarkable precision the very ritual devised by the 12 in Egypt. Each man had been assigned a station in their mock ceremony surrounding the hidden sarcophagus. Harrington, with a mind both vindictive and methodical, chose to eliminate them in that same sequence. I started at the thought. Then what appeared mere chance was in fact design. Exactly. Harrington wove inevitability into his plan, so that the deaths appeared to unfold with the inexorability of fate. When one fell, the next knew his turn would come. It was not the manner of the killing that terrified them most, but the certainty of its order. What hand but a supernatural one, they reasoned, could arrange such symmetry? Thus the illusion of a curse was perfected. Holmes paused, exhaling a cloud of smoke. Yet the human hand always betrays itself. Inconsistencies in time, in method, in opportunity. These are the cracks through which truth escapes. Once I discerned the pattern, it was a simple matter to see who directed it. I could not withhold my admiration, though I confess some chill lingered in my heart, for it seemed to me that greed, guilt, and superstition had bound those men more securely than chains of iron, and that Harrington's cruelty lay not only in killing their bodies, but in enslaving their minds. Holmes reached across to the side table, where he had arranged a series of notes gathered during our inquiry. He tapped them with a long, slender finger. "Here, Watson, lay the true cracks in Harrington's edifice. Observe, the report of Major Carstone's death gave the hour as near midnight, yet the medical examination placed the rigor mortis at a stage which proved the fatal blow must have fallen several hours earlier. Again, in Captain Lyle's case, the supposed time of discovery conflicted with the testimony of a servant who heard a quarrel at dusk. Each discrepancy, trifling when considered alone, became damning when fitted together. I bent over the notes, frowning. So the curse was betrayed by the very clocks of London. Holmes gave a dry chuckle. Clocks, Watson, are faithful witnesses when men are not. Harrington misjudged the precision of time. He wished to cloak his murders beneath the veil of inevitability, yet timepieces betrayed the hand of design. They revealed that a single mind moved behind them all, dictating not fate, but a human schedule. Once I aligned the hours against the supposed order, the deception stood naked. I could not forbear an exclamation of admiration. And thus, by so small a detail, you pulled down the entire edifice of superstition. Holmes inclined his head. Small details, my dear fellow, are the most reliable sentinels of truth. A pharaoh may lie undisturbed for centuries, but a clock will betray a murderer in an instant. As I sat back, listening to Holmes's calm recital, my thoughts turned to the men whose names had been spoken so often throughout this affair. They had been men of science, explorers, and soldiers, men who once sought glory in the desert, uncovering secrets of civilizations long past. And yet, for all their learning, they had fallen prey to their own weaknesses. I could not help but mourn them, not merely for their deaths, but for the manner of their undoing. They had not perished from age, nor disease, nor the hazards of discovery, but from the treachery of one of their own. Their bond, forged under the Egyptian sun, had been corroded by greed, until fear and suspicion gnawed at them more mercilessly than any curse. Turning to Holmes, I said quietly, "It is a melancholy thing, that knowledge and ambition, which might raise men above superstition, should instead cast them into its chains. He gave no immediate answer, puffing thoughtfully upon his pipe, while I continued, half to myself. They looked upon the relic of an ancient world, and rather than preserve it in honour, they sought to conceal and profit by it. And so, their fellowship, born of discovery, ended in betrayal and death. The fire flickered low, and I confess a weight of sadness pressed upon me. For though I admired my friend's triumph of intellect, I felt the tragedy of men who had been undone not by an ancient curse, but by the frailties of their own nature. At length, Holmes broke the silence, his voice grave with the cadence of final judgment. "You speak truly, Watson, but let us be precise. The true malady was not superstition, nor even greed alone. It was ambition unchained. Men will bow before a phantom curse, but only because they recognize in it the echo of their own desires. Harrington was no priest of Egypt, but he wielded power over his fellows as though he were a pharaoh in flesh. He rose, standing tall against the glow of the hearth, his profile cut in sharp relief. Mark my words, the deadliest pharaohs, Watson, are not those entombed in stone, but those who live on in the hearts of ambitious men. For such rulers command not armies, but fears, and strike not with swords, but with secrets." I felt a chill at his words, though the room was warm. There was something inexorable in that truth, that men carry within them the seeds of their own destruction, and that the greatest tomb is built not in the desert, but in the soul. Holmes sank back into his chair, his expression once more composed, the philosopher giving way to the detective. "Now, my dear fellow, I believe we have earned our rest. Should the world produce another curse, I have no doubt it will find its way to Baker Street soon enough." And with that quiet certainty, the case of the 12 men of Cairo was laid to rest. In the quiet which followed Holmes' final words, my thoughts wandered once more to the strange brotherhood of men who had bound themselves with wax seals and whispered vows in the heat of an Egyptian night. Their fellowship, intended perhaps to preserve honour, had become instead the very chain of their undoing. How fragile are the bonds of secrecy, when cemented not by virtue, but by fear and profit. It has always struck me that men, otherwise rational and sober, will bow to the glamour of such societies. There is a peculiar intoxication in the thought of belonging to a circle hidden from the world, of uttering passwords in dim chambers, and of sealing one's word with emblems that hint at ancient powers. Yet beneath the pomp, there lurks a hollowness. The Brotherhood of the 12 was no more than a pact of silence, a silence that invited corruption, and at last, destruction. As I looked into the firelight, I could not help but feel that these secret compacts, though cloaked in mysticism, are in truth perilous toys, their ritual but a theatre masking very human frailties. To men already inclined to ambition, they are a snare. To men already bound by guilt, they are a gallows. Such was the fate of the 12, and such, I fear, may ever be the fate of those who place their trust in shadows. Holmes, who had been silent through my reflections, regarded me with that dry amusement which so often followed my more solemn observations. He leaned back, the faintest smile upon his lips. "My dear Watson," he said, "you grow eloquent upon the subject of secret brotherhoods, yet strip away their trappings and what remains? A handful of frightened men lending colour to their fear. Curses, my dear Watson, are but the poetry of the fearful, and poetry seldom withstands the scalpel of reason." He tapped his pipe against the grate, scattering the ashes. Harrington wielded fear as though it were a sword. Yet fear is smoke, not steel. Once pierced, it dissolves. Those men perished because they believed in a fiction of their own invention, not because the heavens demanded it. I smiled in spite of myself, for Holmes's disdain of human superstition was unshakable, and I could not deny the justice of his remark. The hour grew late, and the fire dwindled to glowing embers. I was on the verge of extinguishing the lamp when the sharp rattle of the bell announced a messenger at our door. Mrs. Hudson admitted the lad, who bore with him a telegram addressed in a bold, unfamiliar hand. Holmes tore it open with a flick of the wrist, his brows lifting slightly as he read. Then he passed it across to me with that same air of quiet amusement. "It seems, Watson," he said, "that the world has already conspired to provide us with another diversion." The message was brief but intriguing, a matter of urgency. Unnatural occurrence at Greyfriars. Require your presence without delay. No signature accompanied it. Only the initials MG. I looked up in surprise, but Holmes merely stretched himself, as though such interruptions were the most natural of life's occurrences. "There is no peace for us, my friend," he remarked. "The shadows of men's follies are inexhaustible. We shall see what this Greyfriars affair conceals." As I folded the telegram, I confess my heart quickened with that familiar mixture of dread and anticipation. For with Holmes at my side, each summons promised not only peril, but the exhilaration of truth revealed. Holmes leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes distant yet sharp. "Watson, the allure of secrecy often blinds the most ambitious men to the simplest truths. The pharaohs we excavate in stone are harmless compared to those who govern ambition and greed while very much alive. A man's desire to control history is far more dangerous than any curse or ritual, for it poisons reason itself. Tell me, dear listener, which detail in Harrington's scheme do you believe proved his undoing? The one misstep that Holmes observed with unerring precision. If this intrigue has stirred your curiosity, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales of deduction. Invite friends to walk the foggy streets of mystery alongside Holmes and Watson.